Hello and welcome to Creating a Human Rights Culture, which aims to promote a lived awareness of the interdependency and indivisibility of human rights principles in our minds, hearts, and bodies, that is, dragged into our everyday lives. What, after all, is freedom of speech to a person who is homeless and lives in a world at war? Therefore, it is dedicated ultimately to the application of the Human Rights Triptych, which in brief consists of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at its center, the conventions, that is, international treaties on the right, and implementation measures on the left.
Reportedly, Hitler had said, "They will forgive me like they forgave Columbus." Furthermore, it was David Stannard in his book American Holocaust who mentioned that Hitler modeled his concentration camps, which apparently he never visited, after the massive herding and literally the working to death of indigenous people by Columbus and his protégés. Similarly, the Third Reich's concern for the production of an Aryan race was reportedly modeled after the eugenics movements in various areas of the United States, speculating that it is no coincidence that a place like the state of Vermont has now only a minuscule Native American population, its original inhabitants, and roughly only 2% of the state are African American. Now let us recall that it was Dr. Robert Lifton in his classic work, The Nazi Doctors, who mentioned that doctors' oaths to Hitler often overrode their Hippocratic oath. As Lifton stated, a number of doctors said that the oath of loyalty to Hitler was more real to them than was a vague ritual performed at medical school graduation. Of course, there's a school of thought that says that all our concern about the harping of Nazi atrocities kind of leads to a certain smugness in our country, that we're doing everything right. I recall that I've gone to Geneva at the UN a number of times, and many of my colleagues actually compared what's going on in Iraq, that children are born with 2 heads, 4 legs, to the Nazi atrocities, and nobody's doing anything about it. That's what they told me. Okay. What I'm saying in the above comments is that when we speak of the Hitlerian era, we are speaking certainly of what took place in Nazi Germany, its bizarre experiments that led to the Nuremberg trials, and the hanging and imprisonment of various perpetrators. But I think we also need to look at some practices that took place in the United States at that time, if not in the present era, to determine if medical policies and practices are consistent with the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and one of its progeny, in brief, the United Nations Principles of Medical Ethics relevant to the role of health personnel, particularly physicians, which arose out of the ashes of World War II. The purpose of the show is not to say that we are all Nazis, so to speak, but rather to point out areas of concern, whatever they might be, such as engaging in research without informed consent and the administering of medication for the sole purposes of the convenience of others, rather than being administered for the health of the patient, thus in violation of the United Nations Principles for the Protection of Persons with Mental Illness. Enough here. Enough said. I am here with Dr. Frank Gatti, a longtime resident of Amherst and a practicing physician, a child psychiatrist actually. I met Dr. Gatti many years ago at a meeting of the Amherst Human Rights Commission. Now, Dr. Gatti also wrote a few words that I'd like to share with you, and then the floor is going to be his. Okay. He said, during the Nazi era, it was alleged that feeble-minded babies, children, and adults would live tragic, miserable lives, committing crimes, unable to work or support themselves. It was said that killing them as infants was a mercy death, sparing them from the terrible life and saving the nation from the expense of keeping them alive. Indeed, there are a few societies and nations that provide and adequately support those with chronic mental illness. In the United States, many of the mentally ill are found in prisons, are homeless, and when they receive psychiatric care, it is mostly of only antipsychotic medications. Now, more intramuscular injections, and discharge is often to the streets, homeless shelters, or not having any residence at all. And Dr. Gatti added, as Eli Wiesel, the late Eli Wiesel, who was a former concentration camp survivor, said, how could physicians do things like that? So, Dr. Gatti, the floor is yours. Say what you will. So comment on medicine during the Hitlerian era with food for thought as to where we are now.
Indeed, when I got interested in this is where we are now, which is we are far from ideal. And the idea of euthanizing infants because their lives would be miserable that is a challenge. And very few societies that I know of have met the challenge. That is, that the society is willing to expend resources to actually make life decent for people who are chronically handicapped, for people who are not likely to make a contribution to the overall gross national product, but are in need of lifetime support. So it feels very familiar that the challenge hasn't been met. We do not now euthanize infants, but we don't necessarily treat them once they're born in a way that helps them. And particularly the thing that has been a problem, I think I first came across the expression in 1988 in which it was said that you've got to run healthcare as a business, not as a charity, not as something which has a special kind of supportive, caring relationship. First, it has to be a business, has to pay its own way. And as I recall, I was at the University of Massachusetts at the time, and when that edict came out, some business type people looked over the continued deficit that UMass ran and discovered that a number of programs were inefficient. And the very first one that I knew of that they got rid of was the child psych unit. They had a child psych unit that specialized in preschool children, young children, feeling that early on in life a lot is determined, and that if a child is struggling early on, the more we know and the more we can intervene at that point, the better the prognosis for life is. And
well, that's true.
Yes.
But they got rid of it.
They got rid of it because it was highly personal. What would happen is that usually the child and the parent would come on the unit, most typically mother, and specialized nurses who were very good at early infancy and development would then work with the pair. And sometimes what they would find is that indeed there were flaws and difficulties in the relationship that was developing and would try to help that relationship. Other times they would find that wasn't the case, that they would find that probably there was something biologically a problem with the child and interventions would be geared in that direction. But the children stayed for several weeks with the parent, and you couldn't do this kind of presentation without a lot of staff. And one of the sad things is the more employees you have, the more expensive it is. And so, like any business, if you can cut your number of providers, it costs less. And that persists right now.
I'm just trying to say, under the Nazis, the people with disabilities were gassed first, before gypsies and Jews, okay?
Before the concentration camps.
Yeah, before the camps, okay. And this was done with the collusion of psychologists and social workers, apparently. Psychologists would give them tests, and they were morons or idiots, and social workers refer them to tests. And, I don't know if you have any more precise data on that, what they were doing in those days. But do you feel there's some of this still going on? I mean, after all, There is the United Nations, it's called the CPD, the Convention on People with Disabilities, and the United States did not ratify it for some reason. I don't know, and I do know that people that have disabilities are roughly, the unemployment rate is roughly 67%. So the question is, how far have we gone? I'm trying to say we're not all Nazis, and I'm trying to say what was done before was absolutely horrendous, but let's just look at, for example, people with disabilities. Or if you want, talk about Jews and gypsies. I mean, you know, with all this white supremacy.
Well, the idea that you can run healthcare and make a profit is inherently a false idea, and therefore no one is doing anything wrong once you agree to that. Once you agree that a profit should be able to be made, then the denial of services or adequate services just follows. And it's not that anyone is making a decision. The Nazis had specialized people in genetics who would actually become even consultants. So if a child was recommended to be euthanized, there could be an appeal process, and more highly educated physicians would look in and to see whether indeed the situation was hopeless. And examples of hopelessness somewhat still exist. One of the criteria was Huntington's chorea, which, although there's been some movement and help in helping this neurological disease, it is a genetic disease, and it is mostly ends up fatally. But also included in that list were manic depressives and schizophrenics, and of course the feeble-minded. And the feeble-minded, an example of how we change about mental retardation. In the 60s, Amherst school system evaluated a professor's child who had an IQ of 65, and they said, we can't educate him here, and directed him to be placed in a living situation in Belchertown, the state school for the retarded. The father of this child was at a conference in Norway and discovered that Norwegians were doing all sorts of things that didn't take the child out of his home and did not require a substantially full-time placement elsewhere from the home. And he eventually tried to reform the care of the retarded in this country and failed, and eventually through a lawsuit we ended up closing our schools for the retarded. And they were closed because there was no substantial treatment that actually was happening. They were being warehoused. And now...
Warehoused, exactly.
Yeah, and now we have a special ed budget. Children who are even more impaired than his child are being cared for by public schools. It does cost communities more money, and it often is done less than as it ought to be done because it costs communities more money. Interestingly enough, I've worked in different communities. There are communities that are quite poor, and indeed they barely have enough resources to fund the regular budget, much less the special ed budget, which is often double or triple the regular ed budget. But also, in wealthy communities, a similar kind of concern. It's really a wish to find less expensive ways of treating needy young people. The other aspect of this is the best treatment they get is while they're kids. That is, when they fully become adults, often there are not adequate facilities to keep them in some form of gainful employment, some ways of being able to live decently. When they closed the schools like Belchertown, there was a court order that required the state to provide for this population because they had been denied their human rights. And a lot of good things happened when that kind of budget was available, but that generation of people is no longer being cared for. And so the kind of community residents that were helpful, the kinds of special programs for daycare and stuff have disappeared more or less. They're still there, but they're there in inadequate numbers, and so only some people can get into them. So our humanity is that we know better. We do some things that are helpful, but never quite enough. And
that's why we're here. Well, keep on going. Well, some of our conversations should have been taped before, but go ahead, keep on going.
The proposal for healthcare reform that has been in the news all through this year,
yes,
is particularly, I don't know what the word is, ironic, sort of unbelievable. So
that's sad.
So it's beyond sad. So, one of the things that was proposed in the Republican plan to get rid of Obamacare was that the government would support help for people's health care by giving tax credits. What they mean by tax credits is you were free to choose whatever policy you wanted. So you could choose a policy that cost $40,000 a year if you could afford it, or you could choose a policy that costs $1,500 a year if that's what you had to choose. And the money that you put into the your health plan would not be taxed. So this was tax-free. So if it's a $40,000 plan, you get a lot more tax-free help from the government than if it's a $1,500 plan. So indeed, we're actually helping to give the best possible care to the wealthiest and to subsidize it with tax benefits. And for ordinary people who choose not the $40,000 policy, partly because they don't have $40,000, their free choice is to have a lower health plan, which provides less benefits, and they are also getting tax benefits, but at a much lower amount, and therefore a lower amount of actual tax support. It's remarkable that such a plan would be offered, and in fact, it's painful to realize it's being offered. One of the things that is fearful about our turn to the right are thinking more as Nazis might think, is because we have actually developed an attitude that I have to look after myself and what is in it for me. And businesses have a right to profits, and there are those who are more deserving of support based on their wealth rather than based on their needs. Healthcare system, obviously, the sicker you are, the more you need healthcare, and the more services you need, the more expensive it is to provide them. So the plan that was offered is just a hard-hearted plan that speaks to us not all being in this together, but trying to support our own self-interest. And that leads to some remarkably negative consequences.
Right, and even, I would say, more violence. I mean, if people don't have care, they get frustrated, and unlived life leads to destruction, like the existentialists say.
And with police killings of proportionately more Afro-American people than others.
Yes.
I think the number is 21% of police killings are in that population, and the Afro-American population in the country is 11 or 13%. So clearly it's a higher percentage than their population. But when the Ferguson killing took place, was it in 2014?
Yes.
Michael Brown. One of the things that has come out is that we discovered that the fines and the various penalties imposed for various misdemeanors and stuff is actually fueling the budget of the Ferguson community. And that seems like, well, it's those people in Missouri, right? Except that it's also true up here. I had a kid patient who, kind of a socially awkward kid, and as he got himself into high school, he decided cool kids smoke marijuana, so he began smoking his marijuana and selling some marijuana to his friends and to people he knew. Hardly a big-time pot dealer, but in any event, he was not terrifically skillful at this, got arrested, and he got a lawyer given to him who he met the day of the trial. The lawyer pleaded him guilty. He was given a suspended sentence but probation, so he had to go to probation, and everything was going okay. He was doing better because the supervision was helpful. And then, God forbid, his father had a stroke, and suddenly the family was in economic chaos, and he couldn't afford the lawyer fee he had to pay, the court costs, and his probation, all of which amounted to a few $100s a month. So in his wisdom, he decided to help his family. So his only skill was he broke into cars, stole radios, and sold them. And that was helping to pay his court costs. Well, very soon, he got caught. He's on probation. He is now brought forward on the original charge and charged with a second felony, which is breaking and entering a car and stealing. And so now he was sent to jail for a year. Yeah. And as a convicted felon, he's no longer eligible for college tuition support. He's actually not eligible
for a number of jobs even.
And his parents, who gained some disability support because of father's stroke, could not house him legally because they would jeopardize their own benefits because they would be housing a convicted felon.
Wow. So
sort of the family would have him there, but he couldn't officially be there, so he even lost where to live.
That's a very sad story. I just noticed time is running out. I just want to ask you one question.
Sure.
Eli Wiesel said, how could doctors do this? Robert Lifton has a whole chapter on the socialization into killing of Nazi doctors. So I'm wondering if you had any thoughts onto how could Nazi doctors do that sort of thing, and even if there are parallels here, Abu Ghraib and what went on there. Yeah. How could this happen? How could we be so inhuman to others?
I think that German doctors thought they were doing good.
Okay.
They thought that they were addressing the needs not just of individual patients, but people in general in Germany. And therefore, the policy of eugenics was in the interests of everyone, including in that quote that you gave, including the person who was euthanized, saying their lives weren't going to be very good anyway, and therefore it was a positive good. Based on a person named Eugene Smith, Eugene Fisher. The reason his name's important is because Hitler, when he was in prison, actually read Eugene Smith's book and quoted it in Mein Kampf. Eugene Fisher had gone to Southwest Africa, the colony of Germany at the time, and he studied people who were mixed race, people who were fathered by white German soldiers and African mothers. And what he found is that they, in their life outcomes, were very similar to just Africans, and therefore felt that the negative genetics of Africa overtook any white benefit from Europe of their parentage. And therefore it was necessary to get rid of the bad genes. Therefore, it was necessary to become a more racially pure society for the good of all of us, because then people would be smarter, more capable, etc.
Like I think happened in the state of Vermont, like I mentioned earlier. Well, it was a pleasure to have you, and maybe we could follow this up with a second look at medicine during the Nazi era. So Thank you very much.
And I can't believe that was a half hour.
Yeah, well, I talked to you before. You're so I've had conversations with you after an hour.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what I thought it was only 5 minutes or something.
Yeah.
But I think we should continue with this at another time, if that's so.
I would be very pleased to.
Take care. Take care of yourself and take care of others.